Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. I'm Mark Searles,
And I'm Samantha Miller.
and this is your source for wildlife news and the people that make it. On this week's episode, New Mexico is in for big changes, Alaska's role-playing wildlife services, cougars in Vermont, and California in a state of emergency.
How are you? How is life? Are you excited for your news stories today? I have no idea what you're talking about today.
Good. I don't either.
Okay. All right. Good, because I've got things to
We're,
talk about.
yeah, we're only doing fake news today.
Okay. What story are you going to make up?
Let's see. How about a story about bears in Alaska?
Ooh.
Does that sound nice?
That sounds really good. Is this
Yeah.
fake news or your real news?
Well, let's see how good you think I am at faking something
Okay. I'm ready.
once I
Let's go.
start speaking. So, say after, I don't know, 11 bears were
hmm
killed this year by the state agency in Alaska, a judge ordered the operation to cease. Yeah. So the Alaska Department of Fish and Game has been doing predator control for the past few years, and they've killed over 200 bears with this.
And are
And
those brown bears or what are they killing?
175 brown bears, 5 black bears, which does not equal 108, and it doesn't equal 200, but we won't get
Neither here
critical
nor
on the
there.
math.
Mhm.
And then 19 wolves, and that was between 23 and 24. And these were done, I'm sure Wildlife Services is jealous because these were killed from an aircraft.
Ooh, yep. I heard about this a long time ago with the bears. I am
The
really glad that
bears.
they the bears. I'm glad they stopped it. So a judge has
Yeah,
told them no more.
so a group um, out of Alaska called the Alaska Wildlife Alliance
hmm
had filed gone to the courts and asked for this to stop because there was no public comment period on this,
Hmm.
and so a judge ruled that yes, it should stop, and then they went out and killed uh, 11 more this year,
Even
and
though they weren't supposed to.
right,
Okay.
and then a Superior Court judge said no, and this violated constitutional mandates, and you
hmm
must stop.
Okay.
And so they actually are going to stop. And the
Are
whole
they going to stick to it this time? Because they were supposed to do it before.
right. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if their hands were above the tables and their fingers weren't crossed.
Behind their back. Yeah.
Yeah, but the whole idea behind this has been for caribou. And so in the 1990s, the Mulchatna herd was about 200,000.
hmm
And now in 2024, last year, they said there was about 15,000.
Oh.
I feel that I'm going out on a limb, but probably not from the bears.
Was not the bears. I guess? Well, first I would like to guess that this is a true story.
Hey, yes, it is.
Okay. Then second, I would like to guess caribou are really interesting and given where they live,
Hmm.
could climate change be impacting caribou herds?
You know what? You are 100% right. And just for that, you get to present the next story. So yes, so the big issue, well, how is climate change affecting caribou populations? It's because there are more woody plants growing on the tundra,
Uh-huh.
and which favors moose.
Oh.
And caribou like lichen.
Do they?
They
And
like a
lichen
lichen.
can't grow if it's warmer outside.
Yeah, and in woody areas. And so That's the big issue. And so it does get a little complex then, right? Where it's like, okay, well, we can't just ban climate change. That would be amazing.
Right,
Can we get a
right.
court order on stopping climate change?
I bet that we could get an executive order from the President of the
Ooh,
United States just
yeah.
and that it's solved.
Nobody likes climate change.
We like it warmer, but only in Florida.
Ooh,
Got it.
yeah.
Okay.
Oh no, not no. Florida does not need to be any warmer.
Mm-mm.
No. So yeah, I mean, good bad news that they have been aerial gunning these carnivores. Good news is hopefully that stops. Bad news is the caribou still face the same problems from climate change. Good news is no matter what the executive branch is going for, a lot of these climate related activities, as far as like changing to renewable energy, it's just financially smarter
Mm-hmm.
for uh, you know people that are consuming large amount of electricity, and so I'm hoping that economics will overcome executive action with
Yeah.
climate change.
Yeah, me too. I hope so as well. It seems like anytime we have an issue with an ungulate, a predator is to blame.
Right.
Right? We
Well, you
go
can't
full
shoot the climate.
right. That's true. That is true. You can shoot carnivores. So speaking of carnivores, I'll start with my bad news story, and it's more carnivore blaming. You ready?
I'm ready.
So you would never guess, but did you know that there is a state of emergency in California in a county?
Mm,
You want to know why?
yes.
Too many wolves.
Damn it.
there are there are too many wolves. Those wolves. So the Shasta County Board of Supervisors sent a letter to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife declaring a local state of emergency in a resolution due to the increasing presence and depredations of wolves. So,
Hmm.
so very, very crazy things happening in Shasta County. Over the last year, there have been 19 deaths statewide attributed to wolves in California, 19 cattle deaths.
Okay. I was like,
Not
what?
humans,
Why have I
not
not heard this before?
children. To put this in context, over the course of North American history, there have only been two human deaths attributed to wolves. One was near a food source. There has only been one freak predatory type attack in the history of North America.
And that one was from a freak. So
Well,
those
obviously,
freak wolves.
those freak wolves. Uh, Not to make light, but I digress. For context, cows kill 22 people per year through stampedes, through doing crazy cow things. 22 people. And I
I'm sorry,
I
but can we have a little segment called Crazy Cow Things?
I mean, it could be a cute cow
No,
things.
but
But
it's
they're also
true.
crazy.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that's from the USDA. We know that wolves account for a tiny, tiny percentage of cattle lost each year. It's so minimal. I think of predator attacks, wolves account for like 1.8% of losses to predators. Like they're a very tiny portion of losses. Most cattle are dying due to respiratory illness, birthing complications, weather. The funny thing is the California Cattlemen's Association was like, look, this number is probably way bigger, but our cows are on these massive rangelands, so we're
We
not
don't
really
know where they are.
sure. We're not sure. And so yes, California is following the trend of New Mexico. There's also been a couple counties in New Mexico declaring states of emergency around Mexican wolves. And it is the most absurd thing I've ever heard in my life. To say that wolves pose a significant threat to public safety, including children, which was also listed in the Shasta letter.
Of course.
Um, it's absolutely absurd. I would trust wolves with my child more than most people. So here we are in our lives. California's being crazy. There are all sorts of ways you can prevent predation from wolves. You can maybe, remove dead livestock,
Hmm.
but that
No,
only works
there
if
is
you know
no
where they are.
science that says that dead livestock attracts wolves. Okay?
There is so much science that says that.
Oh, you're
Um,
right.
you can be around your cows. Like if
Hmm.
you are running a business, like you can actively run it. You can have guardian animals and you can have fox lights, fladry. You can bring your cows closer to you if they're giving birth. I don't know. Like if if I'm raising an animal, like I would help my girlfriend during lambing season, we'd always bring sheep right next to the house when they're
Mhm.
lambing and be there for it. And to say, "Oh, I'm just gonna let them out and see what happens." Um, I feel like that's a recipe for disaster, and that is the risk of your business model, not the problem of the wolves. And these kinds of instances of wolf hysteria are absolutely absurd, and yet they continue because it seems like it's easier to blame a carnivore and to put all of your energy towards that than to really assess your business model and the practicality of it in, I don't know, this century. So
Yeah.
here we are.
Yeah. I've been doing some deep dives on Rembrandt lately.
Oh,
And
okay. Do tell.
and I'm gonna it's gonna make sense. And so last night I was watching a documentary and it brought up how in Boston two Rembrandts were stolen a few years ago, and these Rembrandts were $500 million each. And I'm hearing these wolves and I'm like, oh yeah, why they should have just been like, we had two confirmed paintings stolen, but we don't know how many more. They probably stole 10, 15 more,
Right.
and they
Right.
should have
But we
got
don't
that on their
know. We're not
insurance.
sure exactly where all
Yeah,
those
but
Rembrandts
you
were.
should give us $1 billion.
Yeah, and all of this comes on, the other piece of this too is there's some pseudoscience from the ag extension of UC Davis trying to say that livestock losses are economically much more harmful than reported to be. And again, it's not peer reviewed, and yet these ag researchers are going around and doing like a press tour on it. Um,
Yeah,
so, there's this whole media system that feeds into this hysteria. There's different research institutions that will add on to this. And I cannot wait for some real scientists to review that research because it's very faulty. But I digress. There are good ways to coexist with wolves. I think that the producers that are effective are those that are living with major carnivores on the landscape, understanding how important they are to preserving the very landscapes that we might want to use for cows or sheep or might just want to enjoy. And our guest today will probably talk about that a little bit more, and I'm looking forward to that.
yeah, for sure. I always get a little hesitant whether it's coming from like the ranching side or even on the advocate side about how much does one single animal contribute positively or negatively. Like I'm thinking of like the bobcat thing. There was $300,000 one bobcat brought in, and I'm like, did it? I mean,
Mm, yeah,
and so when we assign these values, first of all, it's not really helpful because at the end of the day, it's just like, okay, how do we just protect our cattle, and how do we encourage more wildlife viewing? And we don't have to have these numbers that really
yeah,
mean nothing except for it's a good headline.
it is. Folks love a good headline. So speaking of headlines, what's
Oh, I got
your
one.
what's your next
Fun.
one?
What would it take to bring cougars back to Vermont?
Some wine and cheese.
Yes, but the wild cougars.
I can only say that because I've been accused of being one. The wild cougars. Okay. So, of the feline type, what would it take? Tell me.
Well, so the House Environment Committee is starting to explore how the state could reintroduce the apex predator. I like in the article it says, by the way, cougar equals catamount equals panther equals mountain lion, and
Oh,
the
good.
list goes on. So that's
Good.
fun.
A cat by many names.
Yeah, yeah, which is one of my favorite parts about uh, uh our naming of cougars. Like, coyote. It's like coyote, song dog. That's about it.
Well, coyote's generally just coyote, you know?
Yeah,
Um, so yes, so mountain lions,
yeah.
Vermont
So
wants its cougars back. And what are they thinking about doing it? And why do they want to do it?
yeah, so they're going to launch a feasibility study for what it looks like to bring them back to the Green Mountain State, and so right now they are looking at, well, how would cougars move from protected habitat to protected habitat? And, they have a really large booming deer population right now. But then they say, well, what would it do if cougars put top down pressure on there? I'm sure that it would probably take the deer population from an unhealthy level to a sustainable level.
Right. To maybe make the herds a little healthier and fit. But I do have to caution, if there is a carnivore in the landscape, deer start acting like deer again. Like you
Oh
can't just
no.
walk up and shoot them anymore. They start watching for predators on the landscape.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And the Northeast is kind of getting we had Chris Shadler on a
Hmm.
couple episodes ago talking about uh, you know eastern coyotes and eastern wolves as well. And the eastern coyote is rarely going to take down a full-grown deer. An eastern wolf has a better shot at that. And so they it seems like they're starting to get a better mix of these apex carnivores on the landscape. But so this is really early on in this, and I like that they're doing a feasibility study. I I am always both excited and hesitant with reintroductions, and we have to think about the individual lives of these animals, and are we setting them up for failure? It's we've obviously been living through that in Colorado with wolves, and it's hard. The thing that makes me feel that gives me encouragement on reintroductions is, yes, that first generation of animals, it can be very traumatic. But once they start breeding, then the next generation assumes that they've been there the whole time. And so it's missing that big traumatic event in their lives. And so I don't know. It's an ethical question.
Yeah. Yeah. I think on the science side, there's no question that apex carnivores are so essential to healthy ecosystems. I always get worried about the human element. And I think that if you do your due diligence on outreach and engagement prior to reintroductions, they can be a lot more successful. I know there's a lot of good work going on with jaguars in other countries that we can do things like that. Um, are you ready for my last piece of news?
Yeah, I do. I wonder, the one last piece on this. I wonder if in this feasibility study, if they're going to put out pints of Ben and Jerry's and see if that's going to be an
Okay.
issue for
That's what you wanted to make
Vermonters.
sure we included.
Well,
Okay.
because you know how Vermonters, I think there's a different word for that. I apologize to anyone from Vermont. Uh, where they love their Ben and Jerry's and they leave it strewn about in the woods, and so
Yes.
we we
Yes.
need to make
With
sure that they're
uh-huh. Uh-huh.
yeah.
Yes. Okay, New Mexico is where we're going now.
Ooh, warmer, drier,
Warmer,
bigger,
drier, less ice cream.
less ice cream.
But
Probably more horchata though.
maybe. So we've got good news out of New Mexico and some exciting legislation that passed to overhaul the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. And it is a full rebrand and new funding. So, and a new governance structure all in one piece of legislation. And so they will get a new name. That new name is the Department of Wildlife.
Hmm.
Their new mission will be more holistic, not just focused on game animals, looking at uh, all different types of species, including non hunted species, and kind of shifting the focus away from just animals that are seen as game. And then they will have new funding, and that comes in the form of, I think it's about $10.5 million over the next 3 years. And that's to help the state start to shift that budget towards non game animals. And then in 2023, they also adopted an ongoing conservation fund that will start funding the agency that way. And then the new structure is really cool because what it does is it lets a bipartisan committee of the legislature nominate three candidates for each of the 7 seats, and the governor has to pick one of the three. And so that way we've got bipartisan folks looking at these seats. It does designate 4 seats, 4 of the 7. One is for a scientist, one is for a conservationist, one is for a hunter angler, and one is for a rancher or a producer.
What are they
So
defining as a conservationist?
I don't know. We'd have to look that up, but I am guessing it would be a non-consumptive seat since they do have a hunter angler seat. So I'm guessing it's probably more of a nonprofit piece.
I
I'm
hope so.
hoping I'm hoping that we can have Michelle Lute from Wildlife for All, who lives in New Mexico, come on and talk about this for us and what this looks like as it's implemented and what other states can take away from this process. The current governor did do a partial veto on one section, which would, right now, she can dismiss any member of that commission. And she's done that in different ways where the commission hasn't had a quorum and hasn't been able to function in the past. She probably won't be the governor forever, so that's fine. So instead of it going to the courts, if we wanted to dismiss a commissioner, it's still in the governor's power to dismiss a commissioner. But it's overall pretty good news. And I'm excited to see how this plays out and excited to see what we can learn from it.
Yeah, me too. And I know that they were working on this for a long time, and that uh, there was lots of input from various stakeholders along the way. On the Wildlife for All Coalition call a month or two ago, they uh, Chris Smith talked about some of the process they went through, and it was, to me, it sounded like the ideal process. Obviously, there's a lot of grappling for certain things from different user groups, but in the end, it sounds like they made the compromises they need to make and held to the items that were really important to each group. And I'm excited to see what the next few years bring for that agency, and maybe they will stop allowing. And I don't. The wolves that were killed down there, they weren't killed by state, right? They were killed federally. Was that Wildlife Services that did that?
Yeah, I believe that was Wildlife Services that did that one. Um, or it was U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services that killed the wrong wolf down there.
Okay.
So no, there's definitely reforms needed. I'm excited to see what we can learn, and I'm looking forward to more agencies being able to focus on all animals. I think the public generally thinks that's what agencies do now, and that's not necessarily the case. So it'll be exciting to see.
Absolutely. Well, I see our special guest of the day popping on, so we will start that momentarily. All right. Well, we have Mr. Matt Barnes with us today. Matt joins us from Southwest Colorado. He is a rangeland scientist and carnivore coexistence specialist. And I certainly will want to dive into, well, what does that mean? But first, I want to thank you for being here. And we can start out with those. What does that mean? And then I'd like to learn a little bit more about your background and how you ended up with those roles.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Mark. Samantha, it's good to meet you. This is going to be fun. Yeah, so I'm going to give you kind of a long-winded answer because there's like five different ways to explain it. But mostly I say that I'm a rangeland scientist because that's what my degree is in. That's what I've published articles on, that sort of thing. If anyone's not familiar with that, rangelands are like forests without trees, essentially, grasslands, shrublands, deserts, most of the Western landscape. So, it when I went to college, there wasn't a degree in like Western studies, but I had seen so many cowboy movies as a kid, and then I discovered that there was this actual program in college called rangeland management, and I was like, "What
Wow.
the heck is that? It sounds awesome." And but I discovered that while I was in my wildlife classes, and so there's this is an interesting story, I think. I was actually a college dropout at one time,
Love this
and
for
the
you.
two
Okay.
yeah, two smartest things I ever did in my life were dropping out of college and going back to college. And so when I went back, and this was at the University of Arizona down in Tucson, I was a transfer student with bad grades, and I had, when you're a transfer student, at least back in the day, you were like the last to register, and it was hard to get into the classes I needed, which probably were like math and English. But I found this class in wildlife management, which I'd never heard of as a professional field, and one wildland fire management and something like Arizona Power and Water. And I was like, wow, you can study this in college? That's just cool.
Right.
And so, 2 months later, I went from having no idea what I would do with the rest of my life to being like, wow, um, I love these classes. I just read Aldo Leopold for the first time. I just read Edward Abbey for the first time, who are not like in the same category, but if you've read them, you probably know what I'm talking
Yeah, I
about.
see the correlation.
Yeah, and I was like, I'm going to be a wildlife professional. So, and then I was a straight A student from there on out, and ended up going to grad school for range management after that because I really liked those classes too. But yeah, so but that's ancient history now. I don't want to give away my age, but it might be more than decades ago at this point. So, um, yeah. Anyway, I ended up working in the federal government as a rangeland specialist and as prescribed fire specialist. And I always wanted to manage a ranch and see if I could show, like, okay, here's how you manage cattle grazing in a way that's beneficial, that, you can have grazing, you can perpetuate your forage and make better wildlife habitat all at the same time if you can figure out how to do it right. The devil's in the details, but I had an opportunity. I was looking for a way to do it, and I walked up to, this rancher's place who I was meeting with, and it turned out like we were wearing the exact same hat. And
That's a
I
way to
ended up
bond. Yes.
yeah, crazy, right? Well, I ended up managing his ranch for the next 3 years, quit my federal job, and I've never had that kind of income or job security ever since, as a financial decision that was absolutely horrible. But all the really cool stuff that I've done in my life has been since then, so it's one of those things that sometimes you just have to take a leap of faith and hope it works out right. Because so here I am, I'm managing this ranch, and there is, picture a 400-acre irrigated meadow bottomland in the mountains of western Colorado. And in the center of it is a big old clump of tall willows. And in those willows is a coyote den. And I'm moving 300 or 400 cow-calf pairs around in a rotational grazing kind of system, kind of like strip grazing, where you're rationing out the grass and you're moving the animals so that they are not regrazing the plants that they just grazed, right? that means that they're at a pretty high, what we call stocking density. And this is all based on how we think, patterns of grazing animals and predators evolved over time, right? So, you know, the classic examples are like the bison of the Great Plains or muskox that, stay in these tight herds. And of course, we think that that pattern is related to predation pressure. In fact, predators are probably the cause of what we now call the herd. So anyway, picture this meadow, coyote den in the center. I'm rotating these cow-calf pairs around, little calves. It's probably June, and I'm like really nervous because this is my first gig as a ranch manager. I'm taking care of somebody else's cattle, and what am I supposed to do if these coyotes start killing cows? Like in my own mind, I have no interest in shooting a coyote. But what if it comes to that? And that's part of my job, right? So anyway, I'm pretty nervous. Turns out we never lose a calf to those coyotes. But those cattle learned that they could mob up and run off a predator like a coyote or the ranch dog. After a few days, I could not bring the ranch dog around anymore because those cattle were going to stomp her to death. And it was fascinating to watch this. And I was thinking about, you know, in the past, like my distant past, I had also worked with black bears and grizzly bears, and I had this sort of secret passion for large carnivores that I mostly wasn't talking about at the time. And uh, to me, it was what I call my green fire moment. So anybody who's read All Leopold knows about seeing the green fire die. And this was kind of my equivalent moment. I was just watching these animals interact, sitting there on my horse, thinking, what am I going to do if this goes south? But the amazing thing is it's not going south. And there's something about the way we're managing this herd of cattle that they have learned to function as a herd, not just a bunch of individuals. And if we can figure out how to facilitate this behavior, this could be the greatest thing for carnivore conservation in decades. Because most of this discussion in carnivore coexistence has been about gadgets like flattery, fox lights, things that make light and noise. They're all designed to scare the predators away. And the reality is, out on the range, you can't scare the predators away. You've got cattle over hundreds or thousands of acres. What you have to assume is that the interaction is going to happen, and how do you set it up so you're most likely to not have it result in livestock depredations? So it's a shift from thinking about coexistence as like, okay, we basically have domestic animals over here, wild ones over there, try to keep them separate, which is, I think, how most people intuitively think about it, to thinking like, no, we can't keep them separate. They're going to intermesh. And somehow we want that to work out well for everybody, at least most of the time, if that's possible. And so most of my last decade of life has been trying to figure out how do you apply that kind of an idea to, intentionally set up ranches for success in wolf and bear country. And so I actually left that ranch after only like 3 years because I was like, you know what? If I want to figure this out, I got to go someplace that's got wolves and grizzly bears. This is Western Colorado in a decade or so ago. No wolves, no grizzly bears, just, coyotes, black bears, and mountain lions. And so I moved to Montana. I worked for a small NGO called People and Carnivores for several years, mostly trying to promote coexistence in various ways, usually with on the ground with ranchers on ranches in western Montana and northwestern Wyoming, and had some successes, some projects that didn't work out. Um, we can talk more about that if you want, but long story short, I ended up moving back to Colorado back in about 2018, and it turned out that was shortly before Prop 114 was going to be on the ballot to reintroduce wolves to Colorado. So inevitably, I ended up involved in that, mostly after Prop 114 passed in the fall of 2020. And it seems like that's kind of consumed my entire mind space for the last 5 years now. I ended up on the stakeholder advisory group that CPW convened to help them draft the wolf management plan. That was a group of 17 Colorado citizens, most of whom were not biologists, but were people. So imagine like roughly a third of the people are sort of livestock centric or ranching centric. Roughly a third are hunting and fishing centric, including outfitters, and roughly a third are sort of more like non-traditional carnivore enthusiasts of some kind or another. Um, and sort of duking it out and trying to figure out, well, are there things we can agree on? And if there are, they're probably good to have in a plan. So, um, and that was a fascinating experience, the most political thing I've ever been involved in. Well, except other than Prop 114, which I had at best a minor role in. So here we are today, and now that process is done. The wolf plan is approved. Wolves have been reintroduced, and I'm currently working for Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative and now on the board of the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project. Both organizations are dedicated to human wildlife coexistence, particularly in the carnivore sphere. And yeah, so that was an even longer answer than I meant to give you, but
Well,
hopefully I
that
haven't consumed the whole hour with that.
I mean that left me with about 37 burning questions, and we will
I
get
get
to.
one of those, Mark. I get one, at least one
Yeah, I'll
question
give
because
you
I have.
two.
Oh, thank you. That was so
Yeah,
nice of you. Go
it's
ahead.
a I'm in a giving spirit.
Wow.
Before we jump into the majority of what you were talking about and herd management and living with carnivores on the landscape and how best to do that. Way back at the beginning, you mentioned that you were a prescribed fire specialist. Is that the right title?
Yeah.
So, so
This
is
was a
that,
long time ago now, but
yeah, well,
yes.
I'm just curious, is that what does that involve? Is that planning where you're going to be doing the prescribed fires? Are you going out and doing them? Is it everything? Is it some of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's all the above, but I was mostly the person who wrote the plans.
Okay.
So for a local field office in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, serving 5 tribes in northwest to central Arizona. So primarily on ponderosa pine forest. Yeah. And of course, as you guys know, ponderosa pine ecosystems evolved with fire, and
Yeah.
we think historically they probably burned every like 7 to 14 years or something. And of course, our Anglo-European ancestors showed up and started putting out fires left and right, and mostly we have not seen fire as a significant portion of the landscape since like 1919, but until the last couple of decades. And of course, that's radically changed because, that the exclusion of fire is, not sustainable. I mean, this land is going to burn sooner or later. And it's a question of, do we manage it? Do we just let it happen? We have lots of people living out here now in fire prone ecosystems. And the big question is, how do we become fire adapted? So, but I only did that for a few years.
Okay.
And the fascinating thing to me is there are so many parallels between fire and carnivores. And I think it might even be a good way for, people who aren't familiar with carnivores to think about carnivore restoration.
Yeah, absolutely. I know Sam has a question.
No, I wanted to hear the parallels between fire and
Yeah.
carnivores that you mentioned, Matt, and then I can ask my other question, which is more about the West, so and Western heritage and all of those good things. So let's hear it. I'd love to hear those parallels between fire and carnivores.
Yeah, sure. And I mostly mean like in the historic sense. So carnivores and fire were both important parts of Western ecosystems, basically almost everywhere in Western North America. So, and somehow the people who lived here in the last 10,000 years mostly got along with those things. In fact, we now know that humans actually started a lot of those fires. So, um, but as we all know, when people came from Western Europe to Eastern North America and eventually to Western North America in what, folks from that perspective would refer to as the quote frontier, we changed a lot of things. And we essentially got rid of everything that didn't suit our purposes. We had this mindset of this land is just a collection of resources to be harvested. And at the time, that didn't even mean sustainably harvested. It meant harvested before somebody else harvested it. So, most of our huge problems kind of date back to that time, right? So whether you're thinking of it in terms of wildlife, that would be the era of market hunting. In in rangelands, that was the open range days. Same thing happened with timber harvest, uncontrolled harvest of resources, and that did contribute to the enormous wealth of a very small portion of Americans in the Gilded Age back in like at the end of the frontier era, which we roughly date to around 1890. So anyway, fast forward, our entire natural resources professions evolved in the hangover of the frontier era. So beginning with, say, well, it's hard to say exactly when it began, but most people would point to around the progressive era, that when Teddy Roosevelt was president and so on. And shortly thereafter is when all of the agencies we now have formed. But it was all in this very specific context of our history on this particular continent. So anyway, we got rid of fire. We didn't like it.
Yeah.
And we got rid of predators. We didn't like them because they kill livestock. And in northwestern Europe, people have been killing predators for thousands of years. They were familiar with animals like wolves, although they'd never seen coyotes before or mountain lions. And it had only been a few hundred years since parts of Europe had their last wolves and brown bears driven out. So, uh, two things that mindset, that culture could not deal with were fire and large predators. And we successfully got rid of them for about a century and finally figured out that they were coming back with or without our help, at least in some places. Fire with or without our help for sure. Carnivores maybe needed some help. But we realized that they were important parts of ecosystems. We had always thought of like disturbance as something from the outside that comes in and changes things. Well, really, they're part of the whole system. And similarly, we think of ourselves as being outside of it, but we're in it too. And I think a lot of our debates about coexistence today kind of go back to where this question of like fundamentally, do we imagine ourselves to be part of these ecosystems or some sort of external force that's separate from them? And I think, here we are, we're bringing carnivores back, we're bringing fire back, but to bring fire back, you really have to do it in a careful way. Like you got to manage it. You got to have prescribed burns. Sometimes you have to have thinning before you have the prescribed burn, because if you just let the whole forest burn in the midsummer when the monsoon season comes and the lightning strikes, you may really not like the result. So um, it's the questions are like, to what extent do we manage it or let it happen on its own? And some of this goes back to like our deeply held worldviews about the right place of humans in a more than human world. And can we manage for the benefit of not just ourselves, but the ecosystem as a whole?
Yeah, I agree. I see a lot of that going back to, religious beliefs and manifest destiny and how we established ourselves as, really the managers of ecosystems rather than a keystone species within these ecosystems, which is how I view us now, is that if we're going to have healthy ecosystems, we have to be a species within that framework. And how do we coexist that way? So my question was really, I grew up idealizing the Rocky Mountain West too, and riding horses and always wanting to be a cowgirl. And then as I learned and I learned more and I love wild animals too. I really love all animals. I've got an animal problem. It's concern.
It's a safe space. You can say it.
It's
I'm
okay.
Sam and I
I
have
can,
an animal problem.
my name is Sam. I have an animal problem. And I still ride a lot. I ride in the back country and I volunteer with search and rescue and do all those good things. It's tricky often for me. And I'm wondering if you have this feeling too, to navigate both being a carnivore advocate and someone who fancies herself a cowgirl. And I don't know how the best way is to navigate that and how we can, as people that choose to live in rural communities and choose to really embrace Western culture in a lot of different ways, navigate carnivore conservation and how you're doing that and how we can really look at the history of both and still appreciate both too.
Yeah, yeah, that is a great question. And I like what you said about being almost like a religious conflict.
Yeah.
And I would agree. I mean, for probably most people in North America listening to this conversation, if you go back to, well, I'll use the phrase dominant culture, I guess. Go back to our origin myth, read it. It basically says we conceive of ourselves as God's hired gardeners. And when we mess up, we get kicked out of the garden. That is like the core of who we think humans are in this earth, which is fascinating. So anyway, they did not have concepts like ecology and keystone species when that was written. And I don't even know how many thousands of years ago that was written. So we do need to keep in mind, like, a lot of these conflicts are conflicts of worldviews. They're not just conflicts of actual animals. So the the biggest thing I want people to know about carnivores and ranching in the American West, we can have it. We can have it both ways. We can have it all ways. But we don't have to give up ranching in order to have carnivores back. We don't have to give up carnivores to have ranching, even though that's what we thought for basically the last couple hundred years. So what we do have is a conflict between worldviews that's driving it all. So, I mean, to use the proverbial metaphor of the iceberg, that, we're fighting about the animals. That's the thing we see tangible on the top. But what's under the surface that's driving it all? And I would submit that that is much more about deeply held values that are associated with different worldviews. And this goes for like all of the culture wars that we have in American culture today. So you've got sort of this very traditional mindset, and that has evolved for a very long time. And and if you're, picture the people who are like all about home and hearth and God and country, and those things are good. I mean, for most of our history as a species, we were basically warring tribes, and it took a very long time for what we would now, in retrospect, call, quote, civilization to emerge. So, to me, like the classic Burkean conservative idea that, you know, if it took so long to evolve and it's probably a good thing and we shouldn't throw it away, like there's some truth to that, right? And so that's like this sort of traditional mindset. And the Western ranching culture is very steeped in that mindset. So, I mean, and that evolved, for most of that time, what we think of as civilization was like islands surrounded by wilderness, the quote, howling wilderness, right? Where you defended everything domestic at all cost against the wild intruding on it, right? Well, as we all know, in the last couple of hundred years, that has completely flipped. Now we have these sort of islands of wildness left in a sea of human driven everything, and that has been associated, of course, with the Industrial Revolution, everything about modernity, which has mostly been fantastically good for humans, but not for everything else. So, and then most recently, we have this sort of like postmodern thing with this environmental consciousness and the whole science of ecology and now conservation biology, like words that didn't exist 50 years ago, probably, but are sort of embodied in laws like the Endangered Species Act and National Environmental Policy Act, things like that. Um, so you have these like three worldviews clashing, and most discussions about politics assume there's like two, but really there's at least three. And in my opinion, what we really need to do is figure out like, okay, none of these are completely right or completely wrong. Like they all have a partial grasp of the truth. Like, the traditionalists have this whole thing about heritage and patriotism, and that actually has some really good qualities. And the modernists basically have science and technology and everything that that has done for us or to us, depending on your perspective. And then, but now we have this sort of environmental consciousness. We know that we're not in charge of it all. We know that we're one species among many, many, many. But we also have to recognize we have an outsized role in ecosystems. We're a keystone species all over the earth, whether we like it or not. And so we need to figure out, well, okay, given all of that, what do we do? you know, and I think it means we find the best of both and let go of, the things that we don't want from, or I said both. I should have said all three.
All
See, there
three.
I go.
Yeah.
You know,
You already polarized it. You made it.
yeah, and I'm trying not
One
to
against
use
the
the
other.
polarizing language, right? Because honestly, I think if like look at our political situation
Right.
today,
Yeah.
the language we use to describe what's happening is itself polarizing. We talk about everything in terms of left or right, liberal or conservative. Not even sure what those terms mean anymore because a lot of things that are being promoted as quote conservative are not conservative by most standards, and vice versa. And I think it's because we've just assumed that there's like two sides and we're trying to find a middle. Well, that usually just gets you mediocrity. And what we need is to go beyond this two sides in the middle framing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Mark. I was
Oh
just gonna
yeah.
say I agree. Let me agree
I
first, and I'll let
agree
you go
too.
for another question. I no, I completely agree. I There's this random sheriff who's crazy, but he lives in Washington, and he has this big sign behind him that says "God, guns, and guts are what makes America happen." And I can agree with a lot of that, but I also think carnivores are important too, and it should be okay to have gods, guns, guts, and wolves. Like how do we make all of that happen together? It's a tough, sticky wicket to attack. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Mark.
I
Have
don't
at it.
think the carnivores care about the God piece. They
Okay,
certainly are
maybe they do.
concerned about
You
the
don't know.
guns, and they do like the guts.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. All right. We got that all sussed out. Yeah. Yeah. I really like how you broke all of that down. And it's funny when we put these labels on when it's two, systems, right, left, Democrat, Republican, all of this. And then it even happens sometimes. I've been faulted for this, that my political party that I align with, maybe someone does something that doesn't align with those values. And I'm like, whoa, but he said he was this, and it's like, but actually it is okay for someone to not be a part of the monolith of their particular identity, right? And that they can have differing views. And so putting this Venn diagram of of being on the ranch and having wildlife and how we're merging these to make it where both can exist together, specifically carnivores, and I'm, wildlife in general. That is another, when you're looking at ungulates and ranching and farming, that's also an issue, can be an issue as well. But we'll go with the carnivore piece right now. So first, how you were talking about the herd that you were working with that tightened up and that was being more aggressive and taking care of themselves. How does that happen?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just a behavioral response to a threat or a perceived threat. So, um, and you'll see this, you can think of this as both a positive and a negative, right? So if a pack of wolves starts chasing a group of livestock and or well, it doesn't have to be livestock, it could be elk, whichever, and they sort of mob up in response to that. And that's just a natural defense. So, and there's a couple of reasons why that works. Um, there's the selfish herd hypothesis, as it's called in the science literature, which it basically says like each animal acting for its own benefit chooses to be closer to other prey animals and therefore reduces its chances of being taken, even if the predator is going to kill at least one prey animal. So it's sort of like it's just the incentives that these individual animals face result in this pattern that we call the herd or the flock or whatever that we see throughout nature. This isn't just limited to like wolves and ungulates. But yeah, so that's one hypothesis. Another one is the many eyes hypothesis, which is like, okay, if we're all here grazing and we don't all have to be on the same level of alert all the time. The rest of us can be like focused on eating and grazing and gaining weight while somebody's looking out for predators. Um, is that exactly how it really happens on the ground? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think you see throughout the animal kingdom that the pattern is safety in numbers, to put it in sort of layman's terms. So And
Sure.
and
Like
that's
when sardines make those balls and the dolphins are attacking things.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and
But
so we see that all the time, and we think, okay, well, we can use that in, say, planning livestock grazing on a ranch.
so oftentimes as you see cows spread out now though, right? And so to get them to then come back into these tighter herds, is there issues with certain breeds of cows that maybe they don't do that as well as others? Is it because the culture isn't there anymore because they haven't had to do it? So it does it take carnivore pressure on those herds to make them then have that deep-seated instinct to come together, or do they have to have some predation on them to kind of figure it out again? Like, how do you get from wide to small when they haven't naturally been doing that?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I realize now that I probably didn't explain very well that most of the time when you see livestock out there, they're probably kind of scattered. They're not
Right.
really typically gathered up, right? So, and there are several reasons for that. And you mentioned a few of them, and they're all sort of interrelated. So, breeds and breeding is part of it, but management is a lot of it. We've had this idea, particularly in rangeland management, for the last century or so, that the way you even out grazing pressure across the landscape is to scatter the animals across the entire pasture. So by doing that though, you're kind of breaking up these the social units that might form in that herd. And so my argument is, well, actually you get more even distribution. And distribution is important because most problems with grazing are not overstocking in the strict sense of demand exceeding supply. They're distribution problems. So animals spending too much time on the creek, too much time close to water, loafing in their favorite spots, going back to their favorite plants over and over again while other plants are not getting grazed at all. So we want to manage the distribution of the grazing on the landscape over time and space. So um, there are lots of ways we can do that, but most of them come back to some form of rotational grazing, some use of fences so that you move them around. Now, you can also do this with herding, but that's very labor intensive and it's fantastic. And that, of course, I mean, if you go to, say, third world countries that don't have easily available, affordable fencing, that is how they do it. I mean, that's how humans have done it for millennia, right? So, um, but yeah, the idea is you can manage to get that dynamic back if you want to, but we haven't always thought that we want to. So lots of things go into that, so what, what do the animals get rewarded for? And if we act like predators when we handle the animals, that changes their behavior too. And so a lot of times what we do when we handle animals, whether it's just moving them from this pasture to that one or bringing them into a corral and doing something that's almost inevitably not going to be a positive experience, they experience some amount of pressure and probably stress from that. And so if being in a group is usually a stressful activity, they're going to unlearn what should be their natural behavior, that being in a group is healthy for them. And so one of the great things that's happening out on the Western Range in the last few decades is something called low stress livestock handling. It was invented by a guy named Bud Williams, who was just spectacularly gifted at handling herds of cattle. And it essentially comes down to working with animals on a psychological basis rather than a physical basis. So you're not trying to force them to do something. You're trying to figure out, how do I, with set this situation up with a bunch of things, including my own body language, to make them want to do the thing that I want them to do, go to the place that I want them to go, and then just sort of let them do it. And then they feel like they get this release of pressure when they do the right thing. And then that's self-reinforcing. And if you can figure out how to do it, it works really well, but it's counterintuitive for most people. Most people perhaps especially people of my gender, want to go and just kind of push the animals to the place where we want them to go. And we usually forget to release the pressure at the moment they start doing the right thing. And then they start being like, well, this isn't working. We're going there, but he's still pressuring us, right? So anyhow, the idea is release the pressure the moment they do the right thing, give them a reward. The release is the reward. So you're constantly training them, if you do it right, to do the right thing. And that if they, or how about this? Put it this way. You want to train them that they have the ability to release the pressure by moving away from you. And then that just results in the right thing happening. And if you do it well enough and consistently enough over time, it actually becomes faster. You would think it'd be slower. And at the beginning, it probably is slower because you're figuring out how to do it. So anyway, this is a great thing because it actually rekindles that herd instinct when people stop acting like predators and start acting more like a lead animal in that herd. And then when actual predators come around, then the animals in that herd learn, well, by being in this group, we actually are better off. And so that's a new thing in animal science and range science that's being applied. It's one of those things that it's been around now for a couple decades. Probably less than 5% of people out there are actually doing it because most people don't know what it is. The trouble is that everybody thinks they're doing it. So it's not just about being calmer and quieter around your cows. A kinder, gentler way of handling livestock. That's what most people think, but that isn't really what it is. It's a very specific set of methods developed by a single individual that work fantastically well when you do them right. And uh, I hope everybody in the ranching world is paying attention because it's so beneficial for so many things like livestock health, weight gains, all of which translates into productivity and profit. Um, and it just so happens that there's also this benefit when it comes to interacting with potential predators.
Yeah, absolutely. And my question really was around the ecosystem benefits then of that type of herd management. I ran cows on my property for a year and they would hang out in the riparian areas. They would, they're scattered and grazing and decimating native plants and really seeing the impacts of that level of grazing. And it was recommended to me that actually grazing like this, where they bunch up and you teach them to bunch up and they are grazing in a smaller area more intensively, is actually better for the environment. Could you talk about that a little bit too?
Yeah, you bet. This is, I could talk about this all day. This is what I did my master's thesis on and spent half my career on. So,
Oh, so cool. Go ahead.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's lots of different names for rotational grazing. The basic concept is you're moving the animals around in a way that makes sense. Doesn't have to be a circle. They just came up with the name rotational decades ago because it made sense at the time. But the idea is you ration out that forage over time and you prevent the animals from going back and repeatedly grazing the plants that they already grazed. So, yeah, you're interfering with their dietary choices in a beneficial way. And so the idea is, in a perfect sense, you would graze the pasture evenly and then not take the cattle out of that pasture and not bring them back until those plants have completely recovered from the previous grazing event. So, and on a small property, that's actually a little bit hard to do because it's beneficial. Well, what you want to have is enough diversity in the forage that you can then have like all different kinds of plants on the menu for the grazing animals, right? So on a small property, that can be pretty hard. It's definitely better on a larger scale ranch, but then also the way we do it, typically at least, is with some kind of fences. So obviously, the larger the scale, the more the fence you need. So, and also more water sources. So on a small property, you probably only have one. On a large ranch, you're going to have many, many water sources over a landscape. And so, for instance, like in a desert ecosystem, like in southern Arizona, you might actually be able to do it just by turning water sources on and off and moving animals that way. You may not need to do it with hard physical fences. So And that's important because, of course, we know fences also are a negative for wildlife, right? So, like on the ranch that I manage, there were old barbed wire fences, and we would maintain those, but we did most of it with temporary electric fence. So you put the fence up a couple days before the animals were there, sometimes a couple hours before the animals were there, and then take it down a day or two after they had moved on, so you didn't have to leave it up all the time. That actually is one of the it's a simple thing, but sort of like windmills on the Great Plains, it's one of those innovations that completely changes how you can manage the interaction between the herd and the grass. So, and now virtual fencing is coming online. It's probably the most revolutionary technology on the range since barbed wire and windmills because
Yeah.
it means that you don't have to have a physical fence everywhere. I mean, you're still going to have them probably on your boundaries, certainly on the side of the roads, but your interior fences can all be virtual. And that is amazing because you program them on a computer and you can move them around. So you don't even have to have them in the same place. And you can really change the way that animals use a landscape using a tool like that. It's expensive. It's not something like you and I are just going to go out and start doing it tomorrow. It's
No.
way more complicated than that. But
Uh-huh.
but I mean, this is really changing what range management looks like in the American West. It's starting slow. I think we're at, picture the exponential growth curve of lots of different things. We're nowhere near the steep part of that curve yet, but I think we will be in maybe a decade. So, and part of it is the expense of the technology. So you have to have these radio towers, and then you have to have collars on every cow in the herd. So some other technologies, maybe you don't have to collar every animal, but in this one you do. Well, all
Yeah.
the mature animals, you don't have to collar the calves because they go with the mamas. But the idea is a collar on each cow, and the way that most of the companies are doing it, you lease the collars each year, but you have to buy the towers, and the towers are really the expensive part. Last I checked, they were around $10,000 a piece, and then they charge you a couple of thousand more if they set them up for you. So most people will like have the company set up the first one, and then they'll do the rest themselves. But you can put them on trailers and move them around.
Oh, that's
Um,
nice.
and if you've got like a big allotment up in a national forest, you're going to need several towers because otherwise you're going to have dead zones, and it takes some time to figure out where you put them. To, well, similar to other kinds of radio towers. Uh, and these, by the way, they're not huge. You can put it on a small trailer and tow it behind a pickup truck. So,
Yeah.
but you can't like pack it in on a horse. So,
No. Okay, good.
yeah,
That's a good size comparison for me to know. Not horse packable, but we can get it on a trailer.
yeah.
And
That is
So you
so
have to
awesome.
be able to drive there.
Yeah.
with these, is it like a shock collar basically?
So it basically it's directional. So it on the animal there's like a left and a right, and as they approach the virtual fence, first they start to get a little bit of a beep, and imagine like going a signal that ramps up from a whisper to eventually a jet engine as they approach the virtual fence line. And also the fence lines are not exact. They're more like they're a lot wider than what we think of as a normal
Sure.
fence, right? It's more like a zone. So um, more
Like a
like a polygon
gradient.
than a line per se. So yeah, and then if they cross it, of course, you know, they may not come back. So uh, there's some training involved. It takes some time. They kind of have to learn socially. And I think, you want to start with relatively large pastures, and over time, as they get used to it, you can make it smaller and smaller. But, like I learned with temporary electric fence, just to make a comparison, if animals are being held somewhere they don't want to be, they're going to find a way out. So some of this is you have to work with the psychology and the behavior of the animals too. It's not like you can just force exactly the outcome you want. It's an art. But I found like animals would go through a 5-strand barbed wire fence before they would go through a single strand of lightweight polywire blowing in the wind because they got so tired of getting shocked that they would rather deal with the hard fence than the electric one. And sometimes even after you remove it, but they knew it was there, they're afraid to go past that point. So I mean but that's not going to happen on the first day. On the first day, they don't know what it is. So, you've got to invest some time in training them and making sure that they don't get out and then get a reward for getting out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so do you have to set these up in quadrants, or can one single tower throw out an area that
Yeah,
works?
it's that.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's just that because of scale, distance, topography, if you're talking about a ranch that's large enough to be like an economically viable ranch, you're probably going to need more than one.
Or eh, and this might be a dumb question, but that's kind of my specialty sometimes. Uh, so we have collared wolves in Colorado. These towers can move. Would it be possible to put that technology on the wolf's collar and then move if there's a ranch? Like, is that even something that we would consider?
Oh, see, I was thinking Wyoming. Just move them back away from Wyoming.
Well,
But
yeah, I
yes.
mean that you could do that too, but are these collars quite bulky, and then adding it on to the technology that's the wolves are already wearing, that wouldn't make sense.
Yeah. Okay. Great question. So, all right, there's a couple of different technologies. The technology in virtual fence is not the same as the technology in a GPS collar
Right.
that we use in wildlife management. So you'd be talking about, I mean, it's conceptually doable. Yes. I don't know anyone who's done it yet, but I'll be surprised if a decade from now that's still the case. I think there's a lot of potential here, whether that is using uh, what we now call a virtual fence collar on wild animals, which is a possibility, or whether that's just sort of integrating them so that, okay, so for example, with virtual fence, you can see on your computer screen where those collars are on a map. And you could be like, hey, last night, 50 cows all mobbed up in the northwest corner of the Samantha pasture. I better saddle up a horse and go see what happened there because that could be a predation event or something like that, and then you're more likely to figure out what happened, find it right away. And that's important. I mean, one thing as you guys know, but maybe not everybody does. I mean, animals die all the time and carcasses disappear fairly quickly out there because everything is scavenging them from coyotes to wolves to bears to ravens and magpies. And so if you do have a predation event, you want to be able to find it, preferably in like 24 hours before the evidence disappears so you can actually confirm that that is indeed what happened. Otherwise, you have no idea. I mean, whether you've got scavenging or predation happening, and you might even not even know that something died. So, especially if you're talking about a large scale grazing allotment. So and one of the things we want to do with, say, a compensation program is create an incentive for people to find carcasses quickly so that they can then be investigated so that we actually know what proportion of them are getting killed by predators and what aren't. And that's, as you know, like the tendency for some reason, psychologically, when we see dead animals, is to think a predator killed them. But actually, data tell us that's probably like less than 5% of the time that the cause of death is actually predation. But there's very often a bear or a wolf there, or a sign that a bear or a wolf was there because they're going to scavenge everything. So, um, and that's again, I know you guys know this, but the whole point of investigating is to determine, well, did the wolf or bear actually kill the animal, or did they just find it dead and start eating on it? So, but you got to find it quickly to be able to do that in a meaningful way. So, um,
Yeah. And I would say that's even twofold from there is that the points to one, find out what did this, but two, how do we use that information then to do better at managing our business, right? Like if I'm in the business of cows, I want to know why the animal died so I can do better with the next cow, whether it's a predator or it's a respiratory disease. I want to know what's going on. so I can have a healthier herd too. I know we're short on time, but how can people find you and learn more about the work that you're doing? And because I think you've got a pretty fantastic website that Mark sent me this morning, and I want to make sure that other people can learn about all of this work on the range. I wish I had your job. It sounds awesome. So how do we find more?
Yeah, gosh. Feel free to look at my website. It's I think it's mattkbarnes.com and or reintegratingwildness.org. That'll point to the coexistence part of my website. There's a couple different parts to it. There's a part about my ranch management business, Shining Horizons Land Management, a part about reintegrating wildness, which is all the coexistence stuff, and then you can find whatever publications I've been in. It's kind of like sort of similar to a professor's website that lists all their publications and that sort of thing, but hopefully a more easy interface and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as you've been talking today, I have been both fascinating and also been like, we need to have Matt on. There's so many things that you talked about that I would love to dive into deeper on future episodes. But I learned a lot, and I love the philosophy and how we ended up where we are, and then the kind of great new tools that we can use now to bring coexistence to the landscape. So thank you so much for joining us on the Wildlife Wire today.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.
This has been an episode of the Wildlife Wire with me, Mark Searles, and my co-host, Samantha Miller. Thank you for listening.